quite sure whether I need to speak today because I've just handled half the questions this morning. But hopefully I'll go through quickly and then just a bit more detail. So just to recap on some of the things I said last time, and to give that overall perspective. So there are two basic principles within Islam which influence the ultimate decision about whether one should donate or receive an organ donation. So the first one is the body is sacrosanct and must not be tampered with in any way. This is the first principle. The second is preservation of life overrules everything else. Okay. So moving on. So the first one is found in this verse, and it's quite important. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. That all of humanity, by the very nature of humanity, they have this nobility. So the human body cannot be tampered with in any way according to this principle. And that's based on the hadith about where the Prophet ﷺ said, breaking the bone of a dead person is the same as breaking the bone of a living person. So the same honour should be given to the body. And following on from Dr. Umar's question, that body, even though the spirit has left it and the body is dead, still has that very high status. On the other side of the discussion, the Quran says, وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا. Whoever brings to life one person or one soul, it's as if he's brought to life the whole of humanity. When we're talking about how we could, the most effective way of getting this message over is actually to give a picture or a video of somebody whose life would not be there. And then put this verse there and say, think about it. I don't think we need more discussion than that simple verse. But anyway, as I mentioned this morning, taking that first principle, the reason why some people say it's illegal is that example that I gave about the hair extensions. That idea that something is forbidden, it is forbidden to use somebody's organ or somebody's organ after they've died. On the other side of that is the fact that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had allowed people to eat haram meat in a situation where they were extreme hunger to the point of maybe of possible starvation. So to preserve life, what was previously forbidden has clearly become permitted. So these principles are the ones that go against each other, and that's why that's the origin, so to speak, of the debate. Right. So to hone in on the real issue that we're talking about now is, as I've mentioned earlier, Mufti Zubair Butt's recent fatwa. Because it was in effect kind of endorsed and sponsored by the NHS, it appears that its status has got slightly higher than I would have expected. Although it's a good piece of work, it's a very important piece of work, and it raises a lot of questions, and he's a great scholar. However, it actually doesn't serve its purpose of clarifying where we go in terms of organ donation. It does talk about organ donation being okay, but the real question, and this was the question that we left with, and that's really the contentious issue, is when. At what point can we retrieve organs? So that's really what I want to look at, take a little bit further. It's not a simple question, and anybody that thinks it's a simple question because I've got a degree in this or a degree in that, philosophy or medicine, it ain't as simple. It is not a simple question. And I just want to quote this publication of the American College of Chest Physicians. The moment of death is among the most mysterious of all human transitions. Culturally defining, death may be as complex as life itself and may vary depending on whether one views it spiritually, medically, ethically, legally or otherwise. And that quote is very important because who are you going to ask? Who are you going to ask? Goes back to what Azra has been talking about. This isn't just a simple decision. It depends on how you're looking at the question. Therefore, the concept is absolutely vital. And it's not just simply about brain death. how we define brain death. I just want to quote something from the same article where it talks about cardiopulmonary function. It says, defining the point at which a patient's cessation of cardiopulmonary functioning is considered irreversible may vary greatly among practitioners and institutions, and may be influenced by the patient's underlying state of health or associated comorbidities. So it's not just that death is a scientific fact, it happens at this point, and I know when it happened. And those scientists and medical practitioners who feel that it's that simple, I suspect have got it wrong. And it's not so simple that, we've got an answer. I don't think we have got an easy answer to this. And it's not something that just doctors are struggling with. This quote from Pope Benedict, I think, is really relevant to where we are within the Muslim community, because he talked about this question some years ago from the Christian perspective, and his conclusion was that actually it's not a simple answer, that it happened at this point. Previously, we had a concept that this is how people die, and nobody was in conflict between the religious, between the philosophers, the ethical specialists, and the medical specialists. Everybody knew this is what death looks like. However, as science has moved over the last 30 years in particular, from the late 50s in particular, that whole process has become rather vague. And as he says here, society has not had sufficient time to accept and change to a paradigm in which death does not follow the pattern of heartbeat arrest. Thus, and then in effect, that we need to rethink our approach to death, because death is a process. It's not defined in the way that we might have done, as the church had done, as the Muslim faith had done in the past. So, where does the Quran stand? That's what Pope Benedict was struggling with, and he's kind of resolved it, so to speak, by saying, it ain't that simple, let's sit down and talk, and let's get around the table and work out. And also to accept that it isn't a science, in the same way that sodium and chloride makes sodium chloride. It's not that simple. What does the Quran say? There was this conference that I referred to earlier. They concluded that there is neither a precise definition of death nor a precise description of how to recognize the departure of all of the ruh, that's the spirit, from al-mawat, the body, in the Quran or the Sunnah. So Quran does not define death. And those scholars who say, well, it says in the Quran, got it wrong, because it doesn't say in the Quran. And what I liked, one of the things I liked about Angela's description of, she mentioned what the signs of brain death were. She didn't say brain death is when. She says these are the signs. And if you actually look at what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, he doesn't define death, he describes death. And when we left the last conference or the last meeting, one of the things that struck me was one of a very well-versed scholar stayed quiet for almost the whole session. And on the way out, he said, you know what we need to look into? There's a saying. And he said to me in Abdul Aziz, he said, this is the answer. It's in a verse, in a statement where he says, Allah yaqbil tawbat al-abd ma lam yughargir, which means that the repentance of the servant, of the slave, will always be accepted by God until the ghargir, meaning the death rattle. And he says that's the point of death. It isn't, because the death rattle, or the death throes, can happen 24 hours, or even more in some cases, before the actual death. So what the Prophet Muhammad was describing a process in the same way that Angela was describing a process. It's not that precise. And therefore, to say to a scholar, an imam, when did death take place? When can we take the organs? When can we retrieve the organs? I think we're asking the wrong person. And that's what that conclusion was. So, it's quite clear, I think, from anybody that knows me, that I support organ donation, that I promote organ donation, and I would like to see more Muslims committed to organ donation, both giving and taking. And therefore I'm not pretending that I've got some neutral, unbiased view. I have a view, and I believe that brainstem death is the correct definition of death, not because I have a vested interest, but because the Quran and the Sunnah, the words of the Prophet, do not define it. Therefore, as long as brain death does not contradict Islam, and the medical practitioners have defined it within the wider paradigm of what the Quran, the Arabic language, says, and it's not contradicting it, then their decision is as good as anybody else that's interpreting the possibility of what death is. And I'm going to requote the linguistic definition of life. And one of the spiritual masters, a man called Imam al-Ghazali, he says that the word life implies two qualities. It implies two qualities. One is al-idrak, the perception, the ability to know what is happening around them. And the other is to affect. That's why when the Prophet Muhammad said that sleep is the small death. Why? Because at this point the rational faculties have left, or the ruh, the spirit, has left the body, in the same way that we talk about death. So it's the small death. Therefore, if that broad concept of the rational faculties being related to what death actually is, then that possibility that brain death is the correct definition is perfectly acceptable. I'm not saying it's the only definition, because linguistically the word tanaffus, or the nafs of what a person is related to breathing. But they're not mutually exclusive. And so if somebody has adopted one definition, for somebody else to come along and say, completely wrong, we're not, that's their opinion. And that's why I think we need to go back to stop pointing at, well, he said this, he said that, this fatwa said that, this fatwa said that. Because if we do that, what happens is, going back to what Arzu had said about the influence on decision making, in some ways it gets back to that point that his beard is down to his navel, he must be right. Or the Pakistanis, we're just more careful than those Arabs. You know, they don't even eat halal meat properly like we do. And that perception would mean at that critical point, they will make the decision not based on what is life and what is not life, but on what is Pakistani and what is not Pakistani. And we need to move away from that and move into the realm of really talking about what is the issue here. What are we talking about? And I'm quite happy for people to disagree with me, say no, the circulatory death, that's the definition, that's fine. As long as we're talking within what is correct in a wider sense, rather than just what is from my personal school of thought. Right, so when we go back to schools of thought, who has said that brain death is fine? If we take the historic, the timeline, so to speak, the word brain death was not used until the late 50s, 58, 59. The first Muslim scholar to talk about it was Ayatollah Khomeini. Only 5 years later, in 1964, he analysed it using his scholarship and came up to the conclusion, this is perfectly fine, correct definition, and that's why in Iran it was never really a problem. Because the spiritual and philosophical leader had addressed the issue very early. That didn't happen elsewhere. I'm jumping at those that are in bold are those that are more Islamic, and those that are out of bold, just plain, are legal states. Libya adopted the law, but not because they had any religious background to it, just they adopted the law. Lebanon, then the Islamic Organization of Medical Sciences, etc., etc. So there's, hopefully, perhaps if anybody's interested, we can distribute this if people really want to know. Those that didn't Originally it was the Kuwait Religious Committee of 1981. It was then changed in 1985, as I mentioned when the scholars came together. Egypt in 1993, they put this forward. It was rejected. In 2010, it was rejected a second time, and there was a very specific reason for that. And if I forget to tell you, please ask me. Right. So, there are a lot of people that said it was fine, and there's a few people who said it's not fine. There is not a consensus, and I'm not going to pretend there's a consensus. There's also some technical issues, even around those that say it's fine. And I'll come to that in a minute. Even where the definition of death is law, for example, in Morocco. So in Morocco, the definition of death is roughly the same as in UK, brainstem death. However, there was a piece of research which said 24% of doctors in a particular hospital where this research was carried out could not define death. So although it's the law, it's not accepted within the community. In addition to that, 37% who did know what the law said didn't believe it. So even if the law says this is what the definition is, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of the culture of what we believe, what we think. So it's not just simply we change the law and everything's going to be fine. It doesn't happen like that. There's also skepticism about potential conflicts. I mentioned Egypt. Why did why was it rejected in 2010? Because when it was introduced, based on a fatwa from Al-Azhar, the place where organ donation became very quick was in the prisons, with executed prisoners. So executed prisoners' organs were taken and given to people who could pay for them. Corruption. So as a result of that, when this became clear, people then looked at this and said, those people that want organ donation, they've got a vested interest. People like myself, who talk about organ donation, they look at Sarah and say, yes, because she's on the organ, but she was an organ donor before she became ill. She was a mentor and a champion for Kidney Research UK, and she got her card the week that she took ill. So she was going out to promote, and then all of a sudden I got an email 3 months later, where have you been? Why are you not doing anything for Kidney Research UK? And I wrote back and said, actually, my wife's been in intensive care and I haven't got time. So, but there's still this idea that people like Dr. Owen, of course he's going to be in favour, that's what his job is. After this, of course, that's what his wife's doing. So that perception is still there in the community. And that's an unresolved issue. And then the technical issues, going back to the last presentation, it was about that we need to get together, because the questions that were raised at that 1985 conference were, actually, if we're saying it's about the brain or the rational faculties leaving, what rational faculties are we talking about? Who decides that? Who decides what has actually left, and at what point? What are the criteria used? Because the criteria used in the UK is different to that that's used in Germany. And that might have an effect post the EU, I don't know. Who determines the irreversibility? With certainty, this is a legal term in Islamic law. And is, one of the questions, is brain degeneration a necessary part? So there are unresolved issues, and it's not for a scholar to answer these questions. It's also not for a doctor to answer these questions, except together. So I hope that might have stimulated some discussion, and hopefully it's put an opportunity, given us an opportunity to put it in its religious and spiritual context. Thank you very much.